best thing you can do is someone like trying to follow the war and like consuming media about it and trying to get a picture of what's going on, which is extremely difficult for everyone involved. Keep in perspective that, the truth is usually somewhere in the middle because the tendency will be, to have all these, there'll be headlines about either Ukraine is getting destroyed or Russia's about to collapse. And they say these tend to go sort of, shift back and forth one way or the other, really hard pivots in media coverage. But yeah, both sides are very much walking wounded, and it's there's not going to be any huge breakthroughs on the front, and there's not going to be any sudden collapse of either side coming up immediately either. Try and keep a big grain of salt, or at least a perspective when reading predictions or news that seems either far too gloomy or far too optimistic in one way or the other.
Hello, and welcome to Talking Ukraine in English. Today, our guest is Neil Hauer, who is a dude that I met at a heavy metal festival in Germany. And I actually interviewed him for a heavy metal documentary. And as we got to hang out, the conversation turned to Ukraine with someone else. And I realized, he was pretty well informed. And turns out he's a journalist, and he's been to Ukraine and reported on Ukraine. And he's been there recently, just 2 weeks ago. We're curious to get your latest insights from your most recent trip and also get some sense of who you are. And Neil lives in Yerevan, Armenia. So maybe you could tell us, how did you get into journalism and how did you end up in Armenia?
Yeah, sure. I mean, thanks so much for having me, Damien. And yeah, very serendipitous to meet at a heavy metal festival, my very non-professional life side of things. But
this is another example of like my worlds colliding. I got the Ukrainian world, the metal world. I had Metal Pilgrim Vladislav Stadnik on a couple episodes ago. He's got a show on YouTube that's pretty popular, but he's in Kyiv and he raises money to deliver the front line. So that was a really cool episode, and it's always nice to have. I have my Teen Onset. This is a Ukrainian heavy metal band whose music you hear in this podcast in the beginning and at the end. So,
very cool. Yeah, no, I'm not familiar with it, but I do love the fact that Ukraine's got such a great scene. I mean, this trip I didn't catch any bands, but on my previous trip, I caught 2 shows in 3 days in Kiev, so it was great.
Oh, cool. All right. Well, maybe we can get into that at the end. So let's jump back to like who are you and why are you here in Europe? You're originally from Canada, right?
Yeah, bingo. So yeah, I guess my broad backstory. I went to university and I was always interested in the former Soviet Union, the Soviet Union, the Cold War, the other side of the coin. This huge country that covered a sixth of the Earth's land surface, but completely different from us. And so I started getting into that, and I started taking classes on that in undergrad, and I ended up taking a lot of classes on Russian and Soviet history, and then also Russian language. I took a year of that, and then eventually 3 years of that, and kept going with it. And then from the entire former USSR, the sort of bit of it that I was always most interested in was the Caucasus, because there's so many different, ethnicities and nations and languages and history packed into such a small area here. And so, long story short, I finished my undergrad degree, didn't know what I was going to do with that, didn't want to work for the government, so went and did a master's degree that was essentially the post-Soviet studies, and I did that focused on the Caucasus in particular. And then after I finished that up in 2016, I decided, I still worked in Ottawa in Canada for a year, and then decided, I want to come out here and see the region a bit that I've just been studying so much and hardly even been here. And so I came out and I thought I'd just spend 2 or 3 months and he'd spend some savings and maybe freelance a little bit, writing a little bit. I was writing as an analyst at that point. And then being out here, I realized I was in Tbilisi, Georgia first. And traveling around out here, I realized that not only was it super interesting, but I really enjoyed living in the region. And journalism just was not something I was trained in at all, but I ended up making friends with quite a few journalists. And it seemed like a pretty natural transition, still writing in a similar way to the way I was, but instead of with analysis, it's the research and your conclusions that are sort of your value added. And with journalism, it's talking to people and going to places and being on the ground. So not a huge departure from that. And so I was doing normal enough journalism, still politics and conflict, post-conflict stuff and international relations, but nothing hard conflict style until 2020. So I had moved down from Tbilisi to Yerevan, Armenia in mid 2019. And COVID happened, and was back in Canada for a bit, and then the big war between Armenia and Azerbaijan began in 2020. And so I went right back to Armenia and was covering that. Reported in Karabakh and outside of it for the next year-ish, on the aftermath of that. And then as 2021 came around, or sorry, start of 2022, things were pretty quiet in the Caucasus, so decided to pop out to Ukraine with a friend of mine, which I didn't have that much familiarity with, but I knew had a master's degree in the former Soviet Union. I spoke Russian, and so it seemed to make, and it was the biggest story in town already at that point, and that kicked off. I was in Kiev on February 24th, 2022,
Oh, wow.
and was there for the whole first month of the invasion and the full scale invasion. And that led to, up until today, 3.5 years in, I just finished, what I think was my eighth or ninth big trip to Ukraine since this all started. And so, yeah, there's your brief history of me getting to here.
Yeah, so you were there the first month. I mean, that was a really scary time to be there because people didn't know whether Ukraine was going to fold really fast or what was going to, and people were panicking and fleeing. I mean, why did you stay and what did you do during? Where were you? What did you do? What did you see during that time?
I mean, the decision to stay like through past my initial like weekish I had planned there was, a friend put it to me. It was an early February, and a friend put it to me in a good way. He's like, man, what are you gonna do? You're gonna leave here. Like, look at it this way. This is not only the biggest story right now, but it's the only story, and nothing's even happened yet. Like, imagine if and when it does. And well, yeah, you're right. And then I remember we were mostly in Kiev, but then we went down and we were in Mariupol, on like mid-February. And I remember we were down there when Biden announced, I think it was like the 13th. He announced like, the U.S. announced like, oh, the Russians are planning to invade on the 16th. And so we're sitting down there in Mariupol thinking, we'd planned to do another couple days here, but let's go back to Kiev tomorrow instead, because we don't want to be here when that happens. But then, yeah, went back to Kiev, and I think it only really started to sink in for people that, yes, this is going to happen. Like, this is really not going to be something small in Donbass, but this is going to be something far more substantial, around the 21st or 22nd, when Putin recognized Donetsk, Luhansk, and had his big Security Council meeting and everything. And yeah, and then at that point, events just started moving so quickly that 72 hours later, there was the invasion.
And you were in Kyiv then, and like what were the next weeks like? Like were you writing for someone or what? I don't know. Like what what were you
Yeah,
seeing
absolutely.
experiencing then? Like what were your what do you remember? What sticks?
Yeah, I mean, I remember like the last night there, like the 23rd, like a couple of me and two colleagues of mine went out with a local friend or two and grabbed a drink because it felt like it might be the last normal night in a while. And I remember being out and everyone's just glued to their phones, like including us. And then we come back to our apartment, which is right on Khrushchev, right in the middle of the city. And I remember it probably would have been just about, just after 5 a.m. We're up there, and I hear the first just like the first missiles hitting the city distantly. And that was, yeah, I mean, that was it. The next couple hours were just sort of like a fever dream of being on the phone constantly and like fielding calls from different news stations and stuff. And I remember popping out at one point, must have been like 7 a.m. or something to the little Perdukti, the little store to grab an energy drink, and saw the two middle-aged women in there, and we hear like explosions. I'm saying like, what is that? I'm like, cruise missiles, like it's happening. And then the feeling, it probably slept from like 8 a.m. till about 1 p.m. that day. And then you wake up at like 1 or 12:30 after a couple of hours of like hazy sleep and waking up and thinking, oh my God, that wasn't a weird dream. Like the Russians are invading right now. And then Kiev being like, going from a complete, like a normal bustling city, like anywhere else, to just on the 24th, absolutely deserted, all the ATMs out of order, one supermarket open, air raid sirens going off, and everyone running to the building, running to the shelters. In front of one of the government buildings, there, a line of guys because they're handing out the Kalashnikov rifles to anyone who's willing to take one to help defend. And I ended up staying in Kiev just for what, for about 48 hours after that. It was the thing is we went and bought enough supplies basically that we could have stayed for like a week or so. But then the second day, the 25th, I remember having a cigarette on my balcony at Khashatik and just hearing like bursts of small arms fire because the Russians, the Spetsnaz, the Kadyrovtsi, like their agents are in the city and they're hunting for Zelensky, trying to find him and kill him. And at that point, I'm thinking like, okay, this is day two, and it's hard to tell what's going on anywhere else, but it's day two, and we've got clashes in downtown Kiev. So the last thing I want to have happen is be sitting in Kiev and thinking, oh man, I really wish we'd gotten out 3 days ago, And so we decided the next day we slept in the metro that night, and I banged out a piece on my laptop on my 90-minute battery there for the National Post in Canada for the paper the next day, and then after 2 hours of sleep there, we got up and we managed to find a taxi to take us down to the train station, and I hopped on the first train we could get going out of Kiev, which everyone was just piling onto them, and then everyone gets on it, and there's a sort of this audible sigh of relief as the train starts moving out. And then yeah, the next month was still running around all over Ukraine, but at least at that point, fog of I went out to Lviv for a couple days, was doing stories out there, and at that point, fog of war kind of settled, and at least that initial sort of complete uncertainty was over.
Yeah, yeah, and there was after a week, it was like I think clear that okay, Ukraine's going to resist. Like the Russians aren't going to be able to just walk into Kyiv and like they thought. I guess that they initially believed that they would, for,
Yeah,
for whatever reason. Like I guess that's what they were told by their handlers and propagandists, and they sort of believed their own propaganda. I mean that's I think they really like once they opened that door they can't close it, and they didn't really know what they were getting into as far as like what that this Maidan revolution and pro-Ukraine sentiment in population is not just a fringe thing, but this is actually like the majority of the country that that feels
yeah.
Ukrainian. Yeah,
And at that point, yeah, once it became clear, like after about a week, it was clear, at least near like Kiev and Kharkiv, it's not that, oh, Russia's not just going to blitz in there and take these cities. Like, I mean, I guess that, like the only place that really sort of happened was like Kherson in the south. But yeah, after a week, it was clear like, there is going to be some big protracted battle, at least for Kiev and Kharkiv, and so things were still crazy, of course, but they solidified a bit past the first like couple of days where everything was up in the air.
yeah. So you stayed there, and then I don't know. When did you leave, and when did you come back again?
The next couple of weeks, I was with mostly with a colleague of mine, a New Zealand Kiwi guy, also a journalist, and we were running around all over the place. I mean, I was in Lviv for the next like 5 or 6 days. I had a bunch of work to do out there, a couple different assignments. He actually went back to Kiev because the crazy thing was like during the Battle of Kiev, like the lines just kind of stagnated. It wasn't At first it did seem like maybe the Russians will come down and like end up cutting off the city, like close the pincer around it from the south, but that didn't happen. And actually, the train stayed open the whole time, so you could take the train in and out of Kiev throughout the whole battle, which is kind of insane. Um, but I stuck out west, and then we went down. After about a week after that, we went down to Odessa, and Odessa at that point was gearing up for being the next in line possibly because Kherson had fallen and Mykolaiv was surrounded on three sides, and we managed to get into Mykolaiv for one day, just for the day, and that was intense because it was literally, it's on the river there, and then the river goes to the west, connects it to Odessa, and then on the other three sides of it, the north, east, and south, well, the Russians are basically surrounded it, and so they had the one road, the one bridge going out to the west, rigged with explosives in case they had to blow it, in case they had to fall back towards Odessa. But we did that, and some the time in Odessa, and then we went up and we were at the Dnipro for a few days, and then we got into Kharkiv, which at that point too was also like the Russians on two sides of it and getting blasted with artillery and a hard place to get in and a dangerous place to get in or out of. But yeah, then we managed to do that, and at that point, we'd each been there for like 2-ish months, a month before the war, and then like 3.5-ish weeks of just nonstop running around during the full scale invasion there, with curfew at 7 p.m. and like barely being able to eat and get food and things like that, and then just running on adrenaline constantly. So it was around, yeah, late. I think it was like the 20th or something of March that I finally got out of there and crossed out and yeah, went to Bucharest and then, went to went back to Armenia and for a little bit.
So I'm curious. So you were in all these like sort of Eastern, Russian speaking cities that historically have voted for the pro-Russian candidate majority of the time in elections in Ukraine. But now that Russia was, conducting a full-scale invasion, um, I mean, when you interacted with people, what was their, I don't know, what was their sensibility like? Were they like, these Russians are assholes, or that were they like, oh, we wish the Russians would just come and get this over with? I don't know, like, or hey, we're gonna fight. Like, obviously the army was gonna fight, but did you interact with like the general population in some of these areas?
No, I mean, I interacted with the people a lot, and people were just sort of, like stunned that it was happening and couldn't really believe it. And, especially like, yeah, these cities like, Odessa and Kharkiv, where you could walk around those cities all day pre-invasion. You could walk around all day, and you could count on one hand the number of conversations you'd hear in Ukrainian. They were Russian-speaking cities, and even then, people couldn't believe it. I mean, I remember talking, like being in Kharkiv and just going past this one apartment building that was just like the side of it completely blown out, and like the apartments just facing to the street now, blown open, and just sort of were standing there like gawking at it and taking pictures. And there's this one like older couple like picking their way up to their apartment, and they see us there, and they're like, the speaker does in Russian, and they're like, well, what do you want to ask us? Like, you clearly, you're clearly journalists, so you want to, what do you want to ask? And we're like, what? Like, can you believe this is happening? And we're like absolutely not. Like, we always thought like, oh, we're not that different from the Russians. They're just the borders 20 kilometers from here. We have family, of course, half our family is in Russia. We sent the videos to our one family member who's in Moscow, and she told us, no, that's fake, and it's also the Nazis in Ukraine's fault. And like people were just in absolute disbelief that it was going on. But yeah, I think in the case of especially in the case of Kharkiv, people felt like there was this sort of sense of betrayal. Not that they considered themselves Russians, but that the fact that there was so much interchange with Russia, of course, because it's right, the border's right there, and so the Russians were neighbors and people that they'd known for years and years and for their entire lifetimes, and then the fact that the they could suddenly be doing this to them was just sort of really hard for people to comprehend.
Yeah, it was hard for me to comprehend the that strategy in the beginning too, because it was like, okay, Russia's going in allegedly to protect Russian speakers, right? And then they weren't welcomed, and then they started like bombing the cities. I mean, I remember in Kharkiv, like when that rocket hit that on the square, that city administration building, and I was like, fuck, like, okay, this is what it is. This is what it is. They're not caring about preserving these cities. They're just going to go in like full. It's like you're not winning hearts and minds. Like with this type of strategy. But I guess this is the Russian way, just total domination. Try to totally intimidate, dominate, and control.
Yeah, I mean, with Kharkiv in particular, it was in the first couple of days they had a couple of these, almost silly, sort of silly seeming like thunder runs into the cities where they just sent like these light armor vehicles in, just thinking basically, I guess that they can just drive in there and there'll be chaos and then they can just set up and take over. And that didn't happen, and these guys got cut off an ambush and captured or driven off. And then after that, they settled into just, well, let's besiege it and bomb it into oblivion. And we were there not even a month into the war on March 18th or something, and the level of destruction was already wild. It was every single street was at least all the windows blown out and shattered all across there, and probably half of them were buildings with huge chunks taken out of them from airstrikes and cruise missiles, and then active artillery just constantly. Yeah, I mean, I remember just being struck by how much damage had been done to the city in just less than a month there.
Mm. Yeah, now we are almost 4 years later. It's hard to believe it. And all this has become normal, like people don't flinch anymore, whether that's in Ukraine, hearing you get used to like death and destruction and hearing about that and seeing it in our screens, people in the West, it's not shocking anymore, right? Um, so how, what was it like for you going back to Ukraine? I mean, you've been back and forth, but on your most recent trip, did you feel anything different? How have things changed since maybe some of the previous years?
Yeah, I mean, and there's sort of two aspects to this, I guess. One is just like the scale of the bombardment, the at nighttime, the amount of drones and rockets that are hitting Kiev and Kharkiv and Donbass. I mean, it's 500 drones and cruise missiles is a normal night now for Kiev or Kharkiv. Like that's a night that happens 3 times a week. Whereas, in the first year of the war, in winter 2022, so like 8, 10 months into the war, when they first started doing this, it would be like a dozen Shawheads or 20 or 30, and now it's 500, and that's just normal, and you can just hear it all the time, just the air defense going off, and then just the hum of the Shawheads, and the louder explosions when the cruise missiles hit or those are shot down. And then but that's at least has some relation to previously, because that was it was that it's still a phenomenon that was happening on a lesser scale for 3 years now in the war. What I another thing I knew would be different, but I didn't expect how different it would be, is the battlefield, which is basically unrecognizable from 2 years ago. I mean, on this trip here, I got out to Donbass again, which I hadn't been to since summer 2023, I guess. And whereas before it was a pretty standard conventional war with, tanks and artillery and infantry and all working together, and the Russians just sort of pounding forward with their massive advantage in artillery ammo. Now it's and like doing these mass assaults and like things that you would expect from any sort of conventional conflict in the last 80 years. And now it's literally it's groups of 2 or 3 guys running around, infantry, just disjointed from each other. Just two or three guys maximum running around on both sides, supported by drones. Drones for reconnaissance, drones for direct strikes, for FPV strikes, and a bit of artillery, not much. And if they're using anything for mobility, is motorcycles on both of them, because it's all about, you bring out an armored vehicle and it's going to get nailed by 10 drones within 10 minutes. And I mean, you look at these sort of people, these sort of crazy cope cages, like these different crazy welding apparatus, welding series of pipes and wire and stuff that they're putting on the outsides of the tanks now. And it seems ridiculous, but that's the only thing that you can do against this sort of density of drones out there. And so that's something that I was really struck by. And then the fact that these capabilities too, the drone stuff, makes it so that before you could get within 5 or 10 kilometers of the front line without a huge problem, in the very relative sense. Like your main problem would just be artillery becoming more frequent, artillery impacts becoming more frequent, and more, and thus more likely to be close to you. And now it's, if you go within 20 kilometers of the front line, you got to have your head up all the time, watching for FPV drones above you, because they can and will see a car, and they can easily decide it's a target and just go for it. And that's the case for now. Now it's happening 40 kilometers behind the front line. So yeah, I was shocked how different it is now with that.
Well, it's a technology race, right? And in the beginning, Ukraine's developed these drone tactics out of necessity because they didn't have all this hardware that Russia had, and it worked. I mean, they were able to eliminate these sort of like slow, big targets that were tanks and other like massive sort of hardware, right? But the Russians have caught up. I guess bought from Iran, and then they started developing their own, right? So they've shifted their economy to like really be able to manufacture these and launch them in like these quantities that were, yeah, you're talking about, that it wasn't present before. And so yeah, I guess the front has totally changed into these like drone wars, and the tactics have changed. For a while it was to Ukraine's benefit, right? Like that's why they were able to like repel and last for for such a long time. But now I guess Russia has caught up, right? Or there's more equilibrium in that sense. So like what did talking to the soldiers, Russia always has more guys, more, bigger machine behind it. Were the Ukrainians feeling overwhelmed, or were they feeling like that they could manage it?
I mean, this is interesting because I mean, I didn't really explicitly ask very much on this trip, but I didn't hear any complaints about we don't have enough men, which is something that I used to hear a lot. And I mean, I don't think that that means that they have enough men, because like there's a huge problem with desertion and just guys going AWOL. I mean, there's just two different types of desertion. There's the guys who go AWOL for a while just because they can't handle it anymore after so much time on the front, and there's no other really release valve for it. And then they go AWOL for a while and then they come back, or they go AWOL and they come back and they join a different unit because one of the reasons they left their unit is because their commander wasn't competent, and they didn't want to just get killed for no reason. And then there's people who just desert and don't come back. But I think I kind of feel like the people, the soldiers who are there now, like, have just sort of adapted to this being the reality, and it's not something they whinge about anymore. But to go back to your question, I mean, yeah, I didn't hear any. I mean, the Russians definitely have more guys still, but they burn so many guys doing these assaults, because it's going through basically open terrain, and in without any protection, with only speed and maneuverability of just being tiny units and just one or two guys at a time, as your only defenses. And so the losses on their side are just enormous too. I mean, it ends up, they do end up getting enough guys through to barely to slowly squeeze out gains in different areas. And sometimes it ends up being little more here and a little more there. But, the Ukrainians don't have enough men for a number of different reasons, but they don't have enough guys to plug in all the gaps in the lines, prevent that from happening. But then, so the Russians do eke forward with that, but then the Russians take such massive casualties doing it too that they don't have unlimited manpower either, and their losses are just so sky high that I mean, it's becoming a bit of it feels a little bit like the stoppable force and the movable object at this point.
But they still seem to be able to recruit new guys every month, right? Like they pay them exceptionally high wages for what is Russia, and it seems like they're still able to find guys who are willing to say fuck it, like maybe I'll get through this, and if not, my family will be better off. And I don't know. I mean, they're willing. I mean, it's like I can't imagine being on a motorcycle and trying to like evade some drones. And then even if I did that then what? I'm there somewhere in enemy territory with like another dude, and what? I don't know. What do they do? Like what?
Yeah, I was having
Like
this conversation with a
insane
friend
to
of
me.
mine. Last week, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who's born and raised in St. Petersburg, works for BBC Russian, and he was saying to me, he's like, I can't. He's like, I thought I knew these people, like Russians to Russian society to some degree. He's like, I grew up in a working class area of St. Petersburg, but it's one thing to sign up for a war to go fight in a war, and like okay, that's an inherently dangerous thing to do, but maybe you'll make it out. It's another thing to sign up for like just exactly what you're saying, like basically to just guarantee that you'll be killed in the next month. Like, and I mean, there is a limit to this thing. It's one of these things where who could say when or how it's going to really catch up to them, but they've been raising the salaries on this and the sign up bonuses again and again and again in different regions, and they're sky high now. And at some point there's a lot of these guys evidently way more than I have, like than my friend who grew up in Russia ever would have thought either. But there's not an infinite amount of them. But yeah, it is kind of mind-boggling the number that we've seen that have been willing to do this.
Yeah, you've never come across the opportunity to sort of like talk to a Russian or like a prisoner of war, or I don't know, someone in Russia who supports the war. Like, have you gotten any sort of insight into like, I guess their justifications for it? Of like, did you ever, I don't know, have that kind
I
of
think
experience? Or
I think there's very few of these guys who are doing this for. I haven't really done a ton of that myself, but from the friends that I have, colleagues that I know, I think there's very. I don't really. I think there's very few of these guys who are doing this for anything patriotic. It's just the ones who were going to do that did a long time ago, and the motivation. I mean, it's financial. The motive what you stand to gain from it is so high. I mean, the signing bonuses in are in a lot of regions, equal to multiple years' salary at this point. So it just becomes this sort of, and then I mean, then there's other like there's temporary effects too. Like earlier this year, there was a big spike in recruitment for the Russians, this voluntary recruitment, people signing up for contracts because Trump was newly president, and people thought, oh, Trump's gonna bring an end to it. And Russians thought this, and that so I'll sign up and I'll get the bonus and I'll get the salary, and then it'll be an easy couple weeks and it'll be over and done. And so I doubt anyone believes that anymore, signing these contracts. But you do have small boosts like that too.
yeah, yeah. I mean, but where were you on this most recent trip? And like, what was the mood of the soldiers you interacted with? Like, what especially given this, I guess back and forth with Trump of one day he says this and the other day Putin's his best friend, and just sort of like that. That Ukraine can't count for America as an ally anymore. They're an unreliable partner. I mean, the only thing they get these days probably is information and intelligence. I mean, what is the morale? What is their feeling about what's sort of going on? On the global stage. Did you
I
get?
don't. I mean, honestly, I feel like no one really cares. They're just like, okay, there's going to be some sort of bullshit that's going to happen. I like half of them expected like, oh, the West will have been like sort of wishy-washy and afraid of Russia and unwilling to give us everything we needed the whole time. So eventually, of course, we're going to get fucked over in some sort of way. I don't think anyone was really, especially at least the anyone I talked to was like, super demoralized by this. I think everyone is just sort of at this point. I mean, people are exhausted by the war, but this was not like a sudden shock to morale, and and for the average soldiers too. I mean, the most important things that the U.S. is providing is things like Patriot anti-air interceptors and things like that. It's not like the soldiers are using. I mean, the soldiers are using like American Bradleys and N113s, like the Bradleys especially. There's a lot of those out there still that people are using. And then the small arms as well, but the small arms is not a hard thing to get. But then yeah, things like the drones, the drones are all either domestically produced or produced in China, and then the frame is produced in China, and then the remainder of it, the explosives and the radio equipment is assembled in Ukraine. So the stuff that they average and it's not like Ukraine is in dire need of artillery shells like maybe a couple of years ago, like when there was the ammunition shortage for artillery was really being felt hard by them, and the Russians were really really outgunning them on that. I mean, the Russians are out of artillery now too. I mean, it's gone from a couple of to 3 years ago, the Russians were out shooting them 7 or 8 or 10 shells to one on artillery, and now it's like 2 or 1.5 to 1 because they burned through the Soviet stockpile, and then they got a bunch from the North Koreans, and they basically burned through that too. And the stats that I saw the other day are basically that their artillery stuff is almost on par, like it's not far off. So it's not like there's shortages in artillery stocks that are coming from the U.S. that would really be felt by the Ukrainian soldiers either. So yeah, I think for the average soldier on the ground, there's not going to be whether Ukraine is whether it the American aid is at the point it was a year ago or now. I think very little that trickles down to your experience for your average Ukrainian soldier on the front right now.
Yeah. So would you say that their morale was relatively high? I mean, given the circumstances?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't notice anything like, people just at their absolute breaking point. But then, again, people at their breaking point, well, then you could use it's sort of a survivorship bias because the people who are at their breaking point have just deserted, have just gone AWOL.
Right.
And this is a huge problem, actually. I mean, it's a problem in the Russian ranks too, but yeah, it's a massive, I mean, it's a massive problem. One's been getting worse in Ukraine, and something that there's just been so many opportunities to fix, and there still is. But I have one friend who's American fighting for Ukraine for many years now, and we met up in Slavyansk, and he has a very long rant about how you know did none of this can all be fixed without you don't need to drop the conscription age below 25 and get that 18 to 25 cohort. It's just you have to actually address the issues that are there within the system, have consequences for incompetent officers, which is the main cause of people. The two main causes of people deserting are people thinking that when you go to the military, it's a one-way trip and
Mhm.
you're there until at best you get maimed, you lose an arm or a leg, probably until you're killed. And then B, that your journey towards being killed is going to be hastened because there's no consequences for incompetent officers whatsoever. People, if an officer is getting all his men killed by launching stupid operations because the majority of Ukrainian commanders or Ukrainian units are still, especially commanders, tend to be older guys, and they operate in this very Soviet sort of mindset. So then if someone's operating in a way that they're just getting their guys killed, sending them on pointless assaults or sending them on missions where they're going to die, they're never relieved of command. They're just shuffled to another unit at worst. And so this sort of stuff leads to these is like the two biggest contributors to these massive desertion rates. So the soldiers that are still around, you don't really hear this sort of stuff from them, but a lot of them have voted with their feet and the left in that and shown their displeasure in that way.
Yeah, I mean, Stepanenko, one of the famous Ukrainian bloggers, he often mentions that, the army needs to be reformed. Otherwise, we're not going to make it. We're not going to make it.
Yeah,
So, and I guess he's hoping that pressure from society, from the general civilization towards the government of like speaking about that rather than pretending these problems don't exist is the best way to go and actually like have some changes, push through some reforms or some changes or things to be at least talked about. And that
yeah, because people have tried this, and sometimes you see this commentary like, "Oh, it's not the time for this." Usually from non-Ukrainians saying this, but and then the response from Ukrainians, the soldiers and stuff is, "Well, we've tried the non-public way for several years now, and it doesn't change anything." So yeah, the worst thing you can do about this problem is ignore it, and it is a fixable problem, but there has to be like the political will to do it, and this is something where it's that a soldier could do a way better, or a commander, an officer could do a way better rant on it than me. But put it this way: everyone in the Ukrainian armed forces I talk to has their own version of this rant about the endless problems, the things that should be reformed, the things that should be fixed, and what they would do, what should have been done years ago. And yeah, soldiers everywhere complain, but and especially in circumstances like this. But yeah, there's pretty much everything they're saying has a lot of truth to it.
yeah. Yeah, unfortunately, Ukraine has a history of corruption, and that's been systemic within the army, going back for some time, and that's, that hasn't it's changed somewhat, but the mentality is still there, especially like with these older guys who are often in leadership positions. Another thing I wanted to ask you about is in your Twitter, you posted about talking to a Ukrainian commander recently, and him mentioning that some of these frontline cities, there are still like civilians who are welcoming the Russians and are basically have pro-Russian sentiment. And in those regions, there's always been like pro-Russian sentiment. I mean, what was your sort of takeaway of like who are these people and how are they disrupting sort of the front line situation from the Ukrainian perspective?
Yeah, this is another thing that is sort of, uncouth to talk about. And like I understand it on one hand because, it's so easily twisted to the pro-Russian narrative of, oh, these cities are waiting for their Russian liberators, but we're talking about 2 to 5% of the population in these places basically to begin with. But then it's also something like you talk to the soldiers and they'll say all these pro-Russians in the pro-Russian civilians that are left in these places, the Zhduni, the waiters, like they're a huge problem and they're constantly fucking with us and they're constantly causing us huge headaches. And I had one talking to one soldier who said like, I can't believe that Ukraine doesn't enforce the just mandatory evacuations from these places
Mm.
because and he's like, I don't know why they don't do it. I guess it's because like the PR might look kind of bad or something, but there is no reasonable cause to be in these cities or villages still that are just getting pummeled to pieces uh unless you are waiting for the enemy. And it's basically, everyone who wanted to get out of these places, these battles are not sudden things. Anyone who wanted to get out of any of these places could have gotten out a long time ago. And with a possible exception of, people do tend to move. Like I was just in the one place near the front that we managed to get into was Dobropilia, which is a couple maybe 5-ish kilometers from the front line. And we met some people there. Met some of the civilians that were some of them were from Pokrovsk, which is just down the road and way and worse off. But it kind of boggles the mind. You think like you move from Pokrovsk, but only to here. Like this is the eighth circle of hell, if that's the ninth.
Yeah.
Uh, but then even like some of the people that we encountered there, you're talking to them, and like the one guy, we talked to two different people, and one of them was a guy who's in his mid 50s, and he told us like his family had all left there. And then he revealed they like, why did you want to leave? He's like, I want to guard against like, oh, bandits, people are stealing things, and like I want to guard my house. But then also turned out he had medical leave that he could go. He had his documents, his disability documents, to go to Latvia and the Latvian documents to receive like a pension and disability care there. And he was choosing to stay there as it's just in this insane danger. And so that kind of makes you wonder why he's really there. And then also talking to this one little old lady, very nice woman, but about 80 years old, had no family, or her family was, and her she was there, and she's very well put together and well to do, but was still insisting on staying there. And all of her family, we asked her like, "Where's the rest of your family?" She said, "Oh, they're all in Russia, and they live in Moscow or Rostov." And so you think, well, this woman, yeah, I mean, you can almost even see her point of view at this point, but because do you think like, well, she, what, she uproots her entire life and goes west, or what, probably is not a bad turn of events as far as she's concerned. Well, if Russia takes over, then probably gets to go see her family again. So you do get these feelings when you're out there talking to, and you meet some of the last remaining people out there, like, and they won't tell you, of course, that no, they're not going to explicitly say that to you, but that you can sort of take out from their stories, okay, the parts of it that don't add up.
Yeah, I mean, there's always been stories over the years of some, civilians or some babushka who's taking pictures and sending it to the Russians of the Ukrainian, military positions or something like this. I mean, it's just part of the deal, Unfortunately, like people in that area just were so Russified over the years, especially the older generation, that they sympathize with Russia and they watch Russian TV and they believe all the Russian propaganda, and that's where their sympathies lies. Like my feeling was, I was like, hey, if you guys want to be with Russia so bad, like get up and go, just go. If it sucks in Ukraine so much and it's so horrible, just go to Russia. It's a big country. Like why torment yourself and everyone else around you? But I mean, that was
Yeah.
before the war. Before the real full invasion started. That was always sort of my thought with these like Donbass regions and what was going on. It's like, geez, guys, just go if it sucks here. But no,
Yeah.
Russians see it as, I guess, historically their territory, and that it belongs rightfully to them. And if they can't, you know, have it, then they will destroy it. I mean, that seems to be like where what their strategy is at this point.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and then they can't get the cities any other, they can't advance any other way, basically, except by, slowly grinding everything to dust in front of them anyways. So, that's what's happening. I mean, the other side of the, the warfare now is like, there might not be much artillery, but the thing that they're using incredibly, at a huge scale now, is these cops, these glide bombs. And these are just enormous. These are 500 to 3,000 kilogram bombs. And, they take a while and they're not super accurate, but they will knock down every building in a city given time. And there's not much you can do about them because the, in order to shoot them down, you would need something pretty advanced. And then they're fired. And in order to shoot down the platforms that they're coming from, which are planes that are launching them from 100 kilometers away. So it's a huge problem. But this is what the Russians are using now to really grind through and just obliterate these cities on the way.
Yeah, it's disgusting. I mean, how much destruction and death that it's hard to comprehend, especially from here, not seeing it. Um, I mean, uh, I had this question. Do you, well, I guess the strategy is to intimidate people and be like, just stop this, like stop the war. We give up, we surrender, just stop the death and destruction. I mean, is that having an impact, like more in the East where you were? Like, are people like, okay, we've had enough. We need to come to, some sort of ceasefire, like give Russia these territories. Let's just stop this because we can't this is just too much, like we're just going to be destroyed, in another year or two. I don't know, like what are these tactics, successful to some degree?
I mean, I'm not gonna lie. I actually have had a couple of conversations with people I know that surprised me. That said, basically, yeah, like how much longer are we gonna do this for? Like, at some point, like, are we like, what are we? How many more years are we supposed to go through all of this? Like, they're not gonna stop. They're gonna just keep coming. Like, including friends of mine that people that I know who are from these regions. It's but like maybe that contributes to the fatalism a bit. But like friends of mine who are from Luhansk and Donetsk, a couple of them that I was surprised to hear it from, but just the sheer exhaustion of it all definitely does get to some people. And I mean, I also think I wonder if like what the regional effects of that are too. Like I don't know personally, but I can imagine some people, especially like in Western Ukraine, thinking like, oh well, who how much longer do we have to do this? Like that's so far away, and like they're basically Russians anyways. Like so, why can't we just cut them loose instead of we all keep dying for this part of the country that Russia's never going to give up because they're going to leave us alone, which I am less certain about that happening, but I can very much picture it. But I mean, then the obvious flip side to that is, well, don't you realize that if this happens, if you hand over the remainder of these areas, well, what's happened to the Ukrainians that are already in these areas is just being conscripted to fight for Russia is just going to happen again in the next wave. And so it really becomes this sort of, devil's bargain where there's no good solution to it. I mean, yeah, I definitely have had these conversations with people who are exhausted and want to bring it to an end, but then, as you go further down that conversation of what's that actually going to look like, you realize how just impossible it is.
Yeah. Well, it seems, despite all the uh, destruction that Ukraine is taking, that Russia is getting more and is getting weaker and weaker year by year. I mean, we've been hearing that their economy is on the brink of like implosion for some time now. But it seems like maybe this next year might be the culmination point for to me maybe because Ukraine is successfully like hitting these oil refineries because these sanctions are in place and because maybe they will run out of people, like because the money's not going to be there as it was, and the reality, I don't know, I have this hope that like Ukraine has no choice but to fight, at whatever cost or whatever they have, right? But Russia has a choice, and if that machine is disrupted, that maybe there'll be a domino effect that will, incapacitate them from being able to carry on this war. I mean, I don't know. Do you feel like that might be a possibility in the next like 2026? That there might be at least
Yeah,
some sort of tipping point, like going in Ukraine's favor.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're totally right, and that it feels like you feel like it's sort of copium, or in a way, or it's a fool's errand to say like, oh, this finally, this will be the year that it all catches up to Russia. But Russia and had a lot of resources. The Soviet Union had a lot of they had a huge Soviet stockpile. It wasn't infinite, and I don't claim to be someone who can understand finance or economics, but a lot of smart people I know who can think that, yeah, this is like 2026 is going to be the year where they can't they can't keep it up at this scale, and they also can't keep it up while basically pretending domestically that everything's fine, that nothing significant is really going on, that the ability to wage war at the scale, or to try to wage war at the scale that they've been doing it, is going to really start cutting into sectors of the economy and sectors of public life for Russians that the regime has been able to, the Russian government has been able to paper over largely to this point. Yeah, like the Russian central bank, the governor, everyone agrees, is extremely crafty, but cannot fight off inflation and all this just essentially fake growth of, it looks like the economy producing things, but all it's producing is uh, war material that's immediately destroyed. No goods are being produced from this growth or this avoidance, whatever growth is happening, the production, increased production that's buoying up the nominal economic standards, the statistics. And yeah, it does seem like I basically have been of the opinion for a couple of years now that I don't see how this war ends basically while Putin is still alive slash in power, and that it basically only ends with a Russian internal implosion of some sort. And it's again, it's not infinite, and a lot of people that I know who are follow these things way better and way more closely and more coherently than I am capable of think that 2026 is going to be a year that things do get really hard for the Russian government and the Russian state to keep things up at this period. So I am, and that is just sort of the gut feeling that my sort of intuition about this as well.
I don't know if being a Canadian, do you feel Canada has been a good supporter? Or and there's a lot of Ukrainian, diaspora in Canada. So you always feel like that they wield some influence, at least with elections and things like that. Like,
I don't even know what our capabilities are like militarily for anything. I don't think we really produce very much. I think we produce like some light armored vehicles or something, like stuff that's not very useful at all in the Ukrainian context. I don't think we have much of a domestic military industry. The main thing the Ukrainians need would just be, previously it was like artillery ammunition. We don't have factories for that. I don't really know what we would have that we couldn't have given it to them. I feel like I don't even hear. Maybe I'll get people point this out to me, but I also know people in the a lot of people in the Ukrainian Canadian community, like in big NGOs and advocacy groups like the Ukrainian World Congress, which is headquartered in Toronto. And I don't remember them whinging about specific things that the government should be doing that it's not. So I don't think there's anything huge that stands out. I mean, it's a pretty like bipartisan, popular position in Canada, and we also didn't have a huge amount to relevant stuff. We don't have a huge amount of relevant stuff to give them, I think. So I'm not hugely sure
all
what
right, all right.
what else.
Yeah. Yeah. Is there anything that we haven't touched upon that you'd like to share that maybe we didn't get to, like as far as Ukraine or in Ukraine or in your experiences, anything?
Not hugely. I mean, yeah, the just the wheel keeps turning, and predicting the course of the war is always a fool's errand. But I always try to just I think the best thing you can do is someone like trying to follow the war and like consuming media about it and trying to get a picture of what's going on, which is extremely difficult for everyone involved. But is to keep in perspective that the truth is usually somewhere in the middle, because the tendency will be to have all these there'll be headlines about either Ukraine is getting destroyed or Russia's about to collapse, and they say these tend to go sort of shift back and forth one way or the other, really hard really hard pivots in media coverage. But yeah, both sides are very much walking wounded, and it's too there is going to be there's not going to be any huge breakthroughs on the front, but there's also not going to be probably there's not going to be any sudden collapse of either side coming up immediately either. So I mean, I think anyone following the war should just try and keep a big grain of salt, or at least a perspective, when reading predictions or news that seems either far too gloomy or far too optimistic, one way or the other.
Okay. Well, you're still going to put together a journalistic piece of work based on your recent trip. So if someone is interested in following up with you on that, how can they do that? Where can they find you?
Yeah, so I'm writing two of them right now, actually, that I've just got commissioned that will be out quite soon, I hope. And then I've still got some other material that I haven't got to yet, but will be coming out. But the easiest way to find my stuff is I am on Twitter at Neil P. Hauer. But yeah, you look up my name on Twitter. I have pretty big following, and that's by where I'm most active work wise.
And thanks for doing this and reporting and caring about Ukraine.
Absolutely, man. Yeah, thanks for having me on. It was fun.
За свободу свою вставай до бою.